Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world.
What really happened to the city that emptied overnight, the thing nobody wants to admit about Gary, Indiana, is this. There's a 6-month period between 1983 and 1984 where the city's population records literally don't match up, not by a few hundred people. We're talking thousands. And the official explanation: Rust Belt decline, factories closing, people moving for work, but that's not what happened. I know this because my grandmother lived there. She was one of the last to leave, and before she passed, she made me promise to understand what she couldn't explain while she was still alive. But here's what haunts me most. She also made me promise not to dismiss what she'd experienced as merely coincidence or urban legend. Because what happened in Gary, it left traces, physical evidence, testimonies buried in archives, and a pattern that repeats in other cities, in other times, if you know where to look. Story begins now, October 1983. Gary was already struggling. The steel mills that had defined the city for decades were shutting down. Families were leaving in waves. But there was still life there, still people in the streets, still the sound of daily existence. My grandmother, Margaret. She'd lived in her small brick house on Jefferson Avenue for 32 years. She wasn't the type to leave easily. Her garden was there. Her church community was there. The library where she volunteered was there. People exaggerate how bad things are, she told my mother that fall. Yes, things are changing, but we adapt. We always do. Except something wasn't quite right. She first noticed it on a Wednesday in mid-October. The mailman didn't come. Not unusual on its own. But then Thursday came, and Friday, and the following Monday. Small thing, right. But Margaret paid attention to patterns. It was how she'd survived, how she'd raised 3 children on a single income. By noticing when things changed, she walked to the post office downtown. The building was open, the lights were on, but when she looked through the glass doors, she saw something that made her stop on the sidewalk for 5 full minutes. There was nobody inside, not a single employee. The mail sorting machines were idle. Letters sat in bins, accumulating. Waiting for hands that weren't coming, she found a payphone 2 blocks away and called my grandfather. He'd passed 3 years earlier. Old habit. She used to do this when she was confused or frightened. Instead, she called my mother. Something's wrong here. That's exactly what she said. My mother wrote it down. She still has that note. When my mother asked what was wrong, Margaret couldn't articulate it properly. How do you explain absence when it's everywhere? But nowhere you can point to. Over the next week, the absence grew louder. The grocery store on the corner, usually bustling by early morning, had maybe 3 customers the entire day. The checker, Tommy, a kid in his 20s, wasn't at his register anymore. Nobody mentioned him leaving. His position just sat empty. The neighborhood tavern, where regulars had played cards and drunk beer for decades, closed its doors without notice. The owner, Frank, just wasn't there one day. His wife wasn't there either. Their apartment above the bar, entirely vacant. People started talking, cautiously at first. Then, with a kind of creeping anxiety that settled into the bones of the community like humidity before a storm. Where did everyone go? People would ask each other on the streets, but nobody had answers. Nobody had seen their neighbors actually leave. Cars weren't packed. Moving trucks hadn't come. People just weren't there anymore. My grandmother began keeping a list. I found it after she died, a small blue notebook with precise handwriting, each entry dated, October 19th, the Chen family, 3 doors down, gone, October 22nd. Pastor Roberts didn't show up for choir practice, October 25th. Saw approximately 6 fewer cars on Jefferson Street, October 28th. The entire shift at Miller's Hardware disappeared between opening and closing, October 31st. The town feels like it's holding its breath. By the end of October, she wrote one entry that would stay with me forever. The silence has a sound now. It's like holding your breath so long you forget why, and the worst part, I'm beginning to understand why they might have left. There's something calling, and I'm not sure I'll be able to resist much longer. That last line, she'd underlined it 3 times. Pressed so hard with her pen that the paper nearly tore. November came, and that's when things shifted from strange to impossible. My grandmother wasn't alone in noticing anymore. The local news sent a reporter, a woman named Rebecca Hayes. She was meant to do a puff piece about the mill's closing. Economic hardship, the changing face of industrial America, instead. She started investigating the population discrepancy. The last official census headcount in 1980 put Gary at approximately 51,000 people. By November of 1983, casual estimate from those still living there was around 20,000. Acceptable loss for a struggling Rust Belt city. But when Rebecca actually tried to contact people, when she compared utility records, when she cross-referenced with hospitals and schools and employers, the numbers didn't make sense. Not just that people had moved, but that people had vanished, in such specific ways that it created a kind of statistical impossibility. A woman would call in a utility disconnect request, then her entire family would vanish before the disconnect took effect. Before the paperwork was even processed, a child would be withdrawn from school, the paperwork filed, and then, when the school reached out to the parents, their phone would be disconnected, their forwarding address empty. Rebecca drove through neighborhoods systematically, marking down which houses were dark, which ones showed signs of recent departure. What she found, she couldn't explain coherently. Entire blocks, maybe 30% of the houses, showed no signs of abandonment, but were completely unpopulated, doors unlocked, cars in garages, dinner plates on tables, TV sets still on, but nobody home. In one house on Madison Street, she found a child's bedroom, toys still scattered on the floor, a half-finished glass of milk on the nightstand. The milk had turned, had been sitting there long enough to separate and curdle. She called the police. They found nothing wrong, said the homeowners had simply moved away, that this was normal for a declining industrial city, but Rebecca kept pushing. She found something in the property records. Something that caught her attention enough to make her drive back to that house 3 separate times. The deed, the ownership history, showed that the house had been owned by the same family for 17 years, generations, practically speaking. Yet the property taxes had been paid by an automated bank draft, the utilities by auto-payment, as if the house was being maintained remotely by a system that had simply forgotten to ask whether anyone was actually living there anymore. She went to the police. Detective named Carlos Martinez took her seriously enough to actually listen. They probably moved away, he said. The exact kind of dismissal she expected, but when she pressed him, when she asked him directly, "Do you know of anyone who disappeared?" his face changed. "We have paperwork," he said carefully. "People who moved away. There's documentation." "But did you see them leave?" she asked. He didn't answer. That's when Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She went to the municipal records office. A dusty basement archive maintained by an elderly man named Gerald, who'd worked there since the 1960s. She asked him a simple question. "In your time here, have you ever seen disappearances like this before?" And Gerald, who'd never mentioned this to anyone, who'd been afraid to even say it out loud, told her everything. There had been disappearances in Gary before. In 1974, another batch of about 300 people, gone within a 2-week period. He'd been there. He remembered it, remembered filing the paperwork, remembered the way the police insisted everything was normal, remembered the way the disappeared people's names simply got shuffled into the relocated files and forgotten. Before that, 1967, another incident, smaller, maybe 100 people, but with the exact same pattern. The same serene calm that preceded it, the same absence of any actual evidence of people leaving. Rebecca asked him the crucial question. What changed? What was different about Gary in those years? Gerald hesitated. Then he pulled out maps, old city planning documents, blueprints for projects that never got completed. The government, he said carefully. There were surveys. Back in the 50s, they were looking at Gary. They were looking at all the industrial cities. They were surveying something. I never knew what, but it stopped, whatever it was. They stopped surveying. Rebecca asked what stopped them. Nuclear contamination, he said quietly, when they realized how much radioactive waste had seeped into the groundwater from all the steel processing. They shut down the surveys. They classified the reports. And they tried to make everyone forget it had ever happened. Rebecca's hands trembled as she wrote this down. She was beginning to see a pattern, a terrible, impossible pattern. But before she could pursue it further, before she could connect the dots between contamination and disappearances, something happened. Her editor, a man named Thomas, called her into his office. "The story's being killed," he said without preamble. "It's not running." "Why?" she demanded. He couldn't look her in the eye. "We received a call from someone in the state government. They asked us not to run it. They said it would cause panic. They said it was based on incomplete information. They said it would be irresponsible." "What's the real reason?" Rebecca asked. Thomas still wouldn't meet her gaze. "I was told that if we ran this story, if we made connections between Gary and contamination, that there might be legal ramifications for the paper. For me personally, they weren't subtle about it." Rebecca never worked for that paper again. She moved to Cleveland, and to my knowledge, she never spoke about Gary again. But not before she contacted my grandmother. I have their correspondence, just a few letters, brief, careful, clearly written by someone who was afraid of being read, in one. Rebecca mentions a pattern. She'd noticed that before people disappeared, they became increasingly quiet, unusually serene. Like people sedated. They smile too much, she wrote. When you pass them on the streets, they smile like they're remembering something wonderful, something you can't access, and I have a theory, it's terrible, but it's the only thing that makes sense. What if their minds are being redirected? What if they're not being taken, but being called, being summoned by something in the water, in the ground, in the air itself, something that wants them to go somewhere else, and they're going willingly, peacefully, because on some level, their bodies remember what the contamination has done to them, and they're going to where they belong. My grandmother underlined that sentence 3 times, and in the margin, she wrote a single word, yes, December 1983, winter settling in, Gary transformed into something unrecognizable. The streets had the atmosphere of a place already evacuated. The remaining residents moved through their days with a strange formality, like they were actors, playing roles from memory. Schools remained open, but with maybe 40% attendance. Teachers showed up dutifully and taught empty classrooms. It would have been tragic if it weren't so utterly surreal. My grandmother visited the library where she volunteered. Her supervisor, Dorothy, was there, shelving books in perfect, methodical order. "Where is everyone?" my grandmother asked. Dorothy turned, smiled that strange, too, wide smile that Rebecca had mentioned. They found where they needed to be, those words. My grandmother couldn't shake them. Found where they needed to be. Not left, not moved, found. Where? My grandmother asked. Dorothy's smile faded slightly, like she was listening to something, hearing words that only she could process. "Down," she said finally. "They're all going down, into the places where the city was built on top of something else, something old, something that was here before the mills, before the steel, before us. And it's been waiting, all this time, waiting for us to make the land unlivable so we'd have no choice but to go to where it is." My grandmother stepped backward. "Dorothy, are you feeling all right?" "Better than ever," Dorothy said, and she returned to her shelving, moving with perfect precision. Exactly the right book, in exactly the right spot. Better than anyone who's left, that night. My grandmother sat in her kitchen and made a decision. She called my mother, told her to come get her, told her she was leaving, but she also told her something else. Something she'd been too frightened to mention before. "I can hear it too," she said. "Not with my ears, but somewhere else, somewhere inside. It's like a frequency that only certain people can perceive, and it's been getting louder. Every day, it's been getting louder. And I'm afraid that if I stay much longer, I won't want to leave." My mother drove up the next morning, and when she arrived, she understood immediately. The wrongness was palpable, like stepping into a room where all the air has been replaced with something else, breathable, but not quite right. The streets were nearly empty, but not abandoned. The people who remained moved with that strange serenity, that inexplicable calm. They waved to my mother's car as it passed, friendly, welcoming, but with no recognition of who she actually was. They packed what my grandmother could carry, clothes, important documents, photographs, and my grandmother's blue notebook, the one with all her observations. As they were loading the car, a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came out of her house across the street. She was carrying a suitcase. "You're going?" she asked, her voice dreamy, distant. "Yes," my grandmother said. Mrs. Patterson looked at the suitcase in her hands like she was surprised to be holding it. "I was going to go somewhere too, somewhere important. I can't remember where. But it's very important. I've been hearing about it, in my dreams, but also when I'm awake. There's a place, underground, where the old world is still waiting, and it wants us to come home." My mother pulled my grandmother toward the car as they drove away. They passed street after street of houses where lights were on, but nobody was visible, and in some windows they could see figures, standing perfectly still, facing inward, toward the darkness of their own homes. But in the basement windows, in the spaces below ground, they could see movement, shadows, figures that seemed to be gathering, waiting. My mother drove faster. My grandmother lived another 26 years. She never spoke much about those few months, but toward the end, as dementia was beginning its slow work on her mind, she would sometimes mention Gary. "They came back," she said once. "Not all of them, but some did." My mother took her literally at first. Assumed she meant people had moved back to the city as the economy shifted. But my grandmother clarified, "Not like that. They came back different. They were looking for something they'd left behind. Or maybe something else was looking for us, and it was using them to do it." After she died, I did research. What happened in Gary was partially documented. By 1985, the population had stabilized around 115,000, well below pre-1983 levels. But the exodus had stopped. People came back, slowly, quietly. They opened restaurants, rebuilt businesses, started churches again. The city didn't thrive. but it recovered a baseline of normalcy, and here's the thing that nobody discusses, nobody admits. But it's there if you know how to look, the people who returned. They weren't always the exact same people who left. I say that carefully. They had the same names, the same memories, the same social security numbers, but they were different in ways that were hard to articulate, but definitely there. They seemed older, all of them, even the youngest, like they'd lived additional years that nobody else could account for, and they were calm, in that serene, unsettling way that my grandmother had noticed in Dorothy. But there was something else, something my grandmother hadn't mentioned until very late in her life, when she was already mostly gone, when she was drifting between worlds. They brought things back with them, she whispered one afternoon. Not physical things, but knowledge, understanding. They knew things about the earth, about what was underneath, about what had been waiting, and they stopped being afraid of it. They accepted it, made peace with it. Peace, I asked her, or partnership, she said. I'm not sure there's a difference. I visited Gary 3 times, trying to understand. I drove through the neighborhoods where entire populations had vanished. I found records, fragments of stories, nothing that fit together into coherent explanation. The post office eventually reopened. The library. The schools filled with students again. The city continued forward, but something essential about it had changed. Something irreplaceable had left, and what returned wasn't quite the same thing. On my second visit, I went to the municipal records office. Gerald, the old archivist, was long retired, but I found someone who'd worked with him, a younger woman named Susan. I asked her if she knew anything about the disappearances in 1983. Her face went very still. Why do you want to know? She asked carefully. My grandmother lived there. I said, she experienced it. She never recovered from it. Susan was quiet for a long time. Then she took me to a restricted section of the archives, files that were marked not for public distribution. There were hundreds of them, documenting contamination levels in Gary's groundwater, dating back to the 1960s. Showing increasing concentrations of radioactive isotopes, showing calculations about how long it would take for the water table to become toxic, showing projections about mutation rates, neurological changes, what the government had called unexpected behavioral modifications. They knew. Susan said quietly, in the 70s, they knew what was happening to the water, what it was doing to people, and they documented it all, classified it, and then they waited. Waited for what? I asked. For the population to figure out they weren't safe here anymore, Susan said. Except they didn't want people to evacuate in panic, so they let the contamination do the work, let it change people's brains in subtle ways, let it make them want to leave, but not in a way that caused chaos, in a way that seemed natural, organic. What about the ones who came back? I asked. Susan hesitated. The ones who came back, the stories about them are strange. They don't show mutation markers like you'd expect. It's like the contamination changed them, and then something else changed them back, or changed them further, into something the contamination couldn't touch. I left Gary that day with more questions than answers, but I kept researching, and I found something. Something that connected Gary to 3 other cities, all industrial centers, all built on groundwater contamination, all experiencing identical population patterns in the same years. Pittsburgh. 1978, 2,000 people vanished over 3 months. Youngstown, 1981, 1,500 people gone, no explanation. Flint, 1986, mass exodus, then selective return. The pattern was unmistakable, and it was still happening. My grandmother, before she died, made me promise to tell this story. Not to explain it, she said that was impossible, but to bear witness to it, to let people know that Gary, Indiana, didn't just empty because of economics. Something else happened there, something between, something that understood the land better than we do. Something that had been waiting beneath cities for decades, maybe longer, waiting for the moment when the ground itself became toxic enough that humanity would be forced to acknowledge something was very wrong. And when that moment came, when that realization started to dawn, the thing that had been waiting, it moved, it called, it invited people down, into the depths, into spaces beneath the city where the old world still existed, where contamination couldn't reach, or where it meant something different, and the people who returned, they came back with knowledge. With acceptance, with a strange peace that unsettled everyone around them. If you visit Gary now, if you walk those streets, you might notice that smile, that serene expression on certain faces, the smile of people who've made a bargain with something beneath their feet. Something patient and old and hungry for connection. And you might wonder, if you're ever visiting Gary, if you start to feel that strange peace settling in, that inexplicable calm, whether it's the city finally healing, or whether it's something else entirely. Something that's still looking for room to grow. Something that's still calling from below. What I haven't told you yet, what my grandmother made me promise not to tell anyone until I was old enough to understand the implications, is that the contamination, the thing that had been leaking into Gary's groundwater for decades, it wasn't just a byproduct of steel production, it was intentional. In 1952, a classified government project had begun beneath Gary, deep underground, part of something called the Continental Reclamation Initiative, which was supposed to be about environmental remediation, but was actually about something else entirely. They were building. My grandmother found documents, hidden in boxes that Gerald had given to Rebecca, that Rebecca had passed on to my grandmother before disappearing into her new life in Cleveland. Blueprints for structures, carved into bedrock, systems for water circulation, for energy transmission. Specifications for chambers and conduits that served no purpose documented in any official capacity, and radiation. Isotopes that weren't natural byproducts of industrial processes, isotopes that were actively introduced into the water supply, in measured, calculated amounts for decades. They were tending to something. My grandmother wrote in her final notebook, growing something, nurturing something that lives in the rock and stone and earth beneath our cities, and Gary was the experiment, proof of concept. A test to see if you could make a dying industrial city into a nursery for something else, something that predates human civilization, something that only needs the right conditions to wake up, I asked her once, before she died, if she'd ever been called, if she'd ever heard that sound in her head. That frequency that only certain people could perceive. Yes, she said, every day, every single day for the rest of my life, but I resisted it, I held on to myself, I refused to go down, and sometimes I wondered if I made a mistake, if I should have gone, if I should have seen what they saw, known what they knew. Would you go back? I asked her. She was quiet for a very long time. If I could, she finally said, if my body would still let me, if the call was still as strong as it was. Yes, I think I would. Because I've spent my whole life being afraid of things I don't understand, and right before I died, I realized that's no way to live, being afraid. It's a kind of death that happens while you're still breathing. The last time I visited Gary, it was 2019, 36 years after my grandmother left. The city has changed. There's been some revitalization, some hope, new businesses, young people moving back. They're trying to make it work again. But if you know where to look, if you pay attention to the details, you can still see the marks of what happened. Certain neighborhoods where the trees grow strangely, where the grass is always a shade too green, utilities that pulse and flow in patterns that don't match the official documentation, people whose eyes sometimes unfocus, like they're listening to something just beyond the range of normal hearing. And in the evening, when the sun goes down and the city settles into darkness, you can sometimes see lights beneath the streets if you're paying attention, if you've opened yourself to the possibility that not everything in our world is illuminated from above. Some things, some important things, shine from below. My grandmother's final entry, the last thing she wrote in the blue notebook, was this: I understand now why they stayed, why they chose to go down into the earth instead of running away like I did. It wasn't fear that drove them, it was recognition. Recognition that the world we'd built on top of everything else was unstable, was already failing, and that there was something beneath, something true and ancient and honest, that was willing to accept them as they were, mutations and contamination and all the damage we'd done to ourselves. And that felt like love, or close enough to love, that they couldn't refuse it. But I refused it, and I lived, and I watched from the surface while the world continued to crumble, and I'm not sure anymore which of us made the right choice. What do you think happened in Gary that winter? Was it contamination? Was it something worse? Was it something that wasn't a threat at all, but an opportunity, an invitation? Something we rejected because we weren't brave enough to accept it? Comment below with your theories. Share your own stories of places that felt wrong. Places where you sensed something beneath the surface. And subscribe, because next week, we're investigating the Continental Reclamation Initiative, the government project that built something under American cities, and is possibly still building, even now, even as we speak. Even below where you're sitting right now, the scariest stories are the ones buried in plain sight, in census records, in old newspapers, in the memories of people who refuse to talk about it, in the classified files we'll never read, in the places we've been told not to go, in the ground beneath our feet, waiting patiently for us to realize that maybe, just maybe, our fear of the unknown has cost us something irreplaceable. What happened in Gary, and what's happening to the cities you live in? Right now, you tell me.